Hi, and welcome to the PYMNTS.com digital discussion on the future of mobile payments. I'm Karen Webster, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. Mobile payments and its future success. It's a topic, by the way, that's sort of like a riddle wrapped up in an enigma surrounded by mystery, a hard and almost intractable problem to solve. A problem that the payments ecosystem, as many of you know, has been pursuing now for more than a decade. It's a problem characterized by lots of people and lots of activity destined to try to solve it, but unfortunately without a lot of viable and sustainable solutions. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been pockets of success in both developed and developing economies, as consumers all over the world and across all income and demographic groups have been presented with lots of new opportunities to use their phones to shop, to pay, to do banking, and to pay bills. But admission that wide-scale adoption of payments has been largely elusive, as old habits, entrenched technologies and infrastructure, and even regulatory barriers have stood in our way. But is now different. Are we poised for success? Are the stars aligning now that new players with new capabilities, new technologies, and existing players with new value propositions have entered the mobile payments arena? Will this be the payments equivalent of Groundhog's Day, where the excitement and enthusiasm gives way to old habits and those entrenched technologies, and we continue to plod along? That is the discussion we're going to have today, and it's a discussion that I'm delighted to have with Srini Nidugondi, SVP from Mahindra Comviva. Srini, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure to be on the call today.
So Srini works with a variety of clients, as most of you probably know, either he or his firm's reputation, and it is his role in helping those clients day in and day out solve the mobile payments riddle wrapped up in an enigma surrounded by mystery. So Srini, how hard is that to do day in and day out?
Well, I don't think it's hard as much as interesting. And as you just mentioned, it's not just an enigma and a riddle, but depending on the geography, the continent, and the market segment that you're speaking to, the different connotations that people kind of have. And so when you kind of really interact with them, look at their problem statements, I think it's a lot of fun than difficulty. But translating that problem statement or the requirement into a viable solution, I think is a lot of hard work, is what I would say.
So let's get into our discussion. I know that we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'll mention to everyone who is listening that we're going to take comments along the way, questions as well. But let's get into it. So Srini, what do you think is going on now that creates perhaps an environment for success that hasn't necessarily positioned us that way in the past?
Right. If I were to kind of, again, look at a specific geography, I think the answer would be different in different contexts. But starting off with the U.S. as a region, very clearly we're seeing a bit of a movement forward of the using mobile as a device to make for payments and also check for your banking account, your the status of how much money you have, pay for your bills, etc. So very clearly we see a bit of a movement really happening there with some 22% of the U.S. population claiming that they've done some bit of a mobile payment over the last year or so. I think that's a terrific forward movement is what I would say. But again, if I were to kind of really take a bit of a macro view, and as you rightly mentioned, there are pockets where we see phenomenal growth, and we see pockets where the adoption is still next to nothing. And I think it's a context of saying that how do we look at what's been working in that specific pockets and how do we really try to see and replicate it across is the way I would kind of look at it. I would just kind of cut across and look at other geographies for a second and say that, talking about the emerging markets, for example, we've seen that mobile payments is the only way you see digital payments going forward. Again, if I were to kind of look at proximity payments or over-the-counter payments, as I would like to call it, I think we're still far from, even scratching the surface. While we have examples like at Starbucks where 16% of the overall transactions are through the mobile, but for me, there are isolated cases, and I think there's a lot of things that we need to do to get to those levels across the overall spectrum is the way I'm kind of looking at it.
So I think you raise a good point, and that is, what do we mean when we say mobile payments? Because I do think it means different things to different people, and I know even when the Fed does its research and asks consumers about whether or not they've used their phone to make a mobile payment, unless you're really specific, consumers don't quite know how to answer that question. Does that mean make a payment with a bill, make a payment at a physical store and take the phone and use it instead of a card, or to use the phone as a substitute for a PC and shop online? How hard is it to really cut through all of the various misdefinitions or different definitions of mobile payments to get a sense of how far we really are or how far we aren't?
Absolutely. I think before I get there, I think the term mobile payments itself is looked at differently or called differently across regions, right from mobile money to mobile wallets to mobile banking to commerce, you name it. I think wherever there's a bit of a payment angle involved, I think the different names by which you kind of really hear, and people kind of really mean different things as well. So to your point, a lot of these transactions that we're talking about in the context of the US actually is www. That's really the mobile browser working for you, either on your tablet or the mobile phone. And that, I think, is also considered to be a mobile payment, and very logically so. But if you were to kind of look at in a different context of a mobile banking, say in India, it's predominantly an app powering, pretty much on a smartphone these days, powering and making the transactions happen. But if you really go into some of the parts, let's say the emerging markets like in Africa or parts of Latin America, we're really talking about being powered through an IVR, an SMS, or other emerging technologies over the mobile network. So it's pretty much, again, depending on the consumer segment, we see different ways by which mobile payments are kind of really termed. Having said that, for me, if I were to kind of look at a holistic angle, it's pretty much divided between, in the developed world, still, as I mentioned, www or the mobile browser being the main way of access. But what I kind of see is that a shift towards apps and a shift towards mobility devices, and that's where I think of the future I really see is the mobility devices like wearables. That I think is what is really going to power mobile payments in the future. And so I will again kind of give a bit of an interesting parallel I've observed recently. The largest e-commerce site in India, bigger than Amazon, called Flipkart, has stopped its mobile browser site. Everything is through an app. So I think that is the fundamental shift that I would kind of see and say that mobile would slowly be through an app. And when we're talking about over-the-counter aspects like NFC, etc., really kind of kicking in. So I think we're going to see a shift in how mobile payments are viewed by consumers as well. But I think it's going to be a shift that's not really perceivable, but it's a more a behavioral shift is the way I would look at it.
Interesting. I'd love to get back to you a little bit later because I know you have some interesting things that talk about the different trends in the evolution. Apps versus browser, I think, is a really interesting corollary. But anyway, let me let you continue. So where are we? Are we getting ready to cross the chasm? This is an interesting debate that I think we should have.
Yeah. And if I were to look at 22% again as the number, or PayPal having again something like 20-odd% of its transactions coming through the mobile, I think the first answer would be yes, we've crossed the chasm, isn't it? At the same time, as we've kind of just talked a little earlier, that parts of it very clearly, because everything that we do today is through a mobility device. I'm using the word mobility more than mobile now. And therefore, it's pretty natural that everything that I would do in terms of a transaction may end up originating from a mobility or mobile device. But if I were to kind of look at a broad basing and saying that, okay, if as an online transaction, pretty much we do it over the mobile devices, but when it comes to over-the-counter or proximity-based transactions, be it getting an alert or be it making that payment instead of using a plastic card, can I really use my mobile phone? I mean, Apple Pay has come in, as we all know. I think there we still have to cross the chasm, but I think we have all the right elements to kind of propel us and get over the gap is the way I'm looking at it.
So I don't know that I am entirely with you there. I mean, I think we've crossed the chasm from the mobile perspective, and I think maybe in certain pockets. So if you look at Kenya with M-Pesa, I would say yes, the chasm's been crossed. But would you say the chasm's been crossed in developed economies like the U.S. and the U.K.? Would your answer be different if you were looking at specific pieces of the world and maybe even different segments within mobile?
Absolutely, Karen. And for me, I would use three words to kind of describe, and the three words are open to interpretation in different ways. So I would say way to go. And as you mentioned, Kenya or Zimbabwe or lots of African countries, it's way to go because they've really shown us the way of how to adopt digital and mobile payments. What with 43% of Zimbabwe's economy now being powered through mobile payments, for example, or Kenya, I think, is pretty much the flag bearer for mobile payments. But the other way to go is saying that I think we still have a bit of a way to go before we get to a point of saying that are everybody comfortable with the mobile device being a trusted source to end up making a payment, and a payment where I'm used to, with multiple cards in my wallet. How do I use those cards rather than using a mobile number to make a payment? I think in that context, I think we still have a distance before we can say that we've kind of got there. And I was mentioning earlier, I think all the environmental forces, if I may use that term, pretty much seem to be indicating that we're ready to kind of bridge the gap.
Well, I think it's interesting. I know on your next slide you're gonna sort of show us how the various players across a variety of ecosystems are playing in mobile payments. So let's sort of park the chasm comment until we get to that. So why don't you walk us through who's doing what?
Yeah. It's interesting that every player that we could kind of think of who's operating with the semblance of mobile in it, or actually digital in it, if I may, are clearly getting into the mobile payments space. Logically, the telecom operators have always been wanting to kind of play an active role. And I think if you were to take off the emerging economies back to the developed world, pretty much it's still operators like TIM or Vodafone, etc., clearly playing pretty much an active role. And every day we see news of them adopting or adapting to the market requirements by coming out with new and interesting ways of business models and technology. So that's kind of been interesting. But what kind of really interests me is that entities like Microsoft and Google, for example, really kind of trying to play that much an active role and believing that the mobile payments would really be an integral way of approaching their business. And I think that's what I think is quite heartening, is what I would say. And I believe some of them would succeed and some of them obviously may not be as successful. But the very fact that everybody is really believing in the market and really kind of trying to kind of put their acts together and come out with creative new models, I think is interesting for me.
So how would you handicap the success of the various players that you've listed here? I mean, obviously some of them, like the payments companies, work across a variety of the ecosystems because that's what they need to do to get scale. They enable the telcos and the technology players and the OEMs to make payments possible. But do you have a sense of how the landscape is going to shake out? What are you seeing, and what are you talking to your clients about?
Sure. So I think, firstly for me, the landscape in a way is also a bit of a consolidation that I clearly see the way the market is moving. And if I were to kind of look at the earlier slide and the current slide on consolidation, and if I were to kind of really see what I kind of see that is all the big players are putting in their muzzle, and the belief is that you really need that big marketing and financial muzzle to ensure that the adoption really gets going. And that, I think, is clearly what I can see. But if I were to also kind of talk about the other participants in the industry, be it a Facebook or a Twitter, what interests me is that for them the belief is that really act on every movement of the consumer and ensure that their logo is really present every time I'm doing a transaction or doing any behavioral movement, if I may. And I think that's clearly what I kind of see a shift. So using a Twitter to make, through a hashtag making a payment, or Facebook now kind of applying for licenses pretty much across all states and ensuring the remittances kind of happen, I think is clearly a big war that's building up. And that coupled with what I was talking about, the consolidation that following Apple Pay, Samsung now kind of getting into the mix by acquiring Loop, or Google picking up the assets of Softcat. I think it's going to be an interesting. It's going to be interesting times is the way I'm kind of looking at it. And while we talk about consolidation, I think the very fact that so many players are there, it's only going to be a handful who will be successful, and the jury is still out as to who really would be the real winner out there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's going to be consolidation. I think it's still, not a winner take all market because payments it just isn't by its nature. But I think what is fascinating is how many of the technology players are really getting into payments in a very, very big way. If you look at the names that you have on this particular slide, they may be working as part of their infrastructure with traditional players, but their name isn't on the front door, so to speak. It's Samsung, it's Google, it's PayPal, it's Apple, it's Facebook. It's a really interesting shift and a really interesting observation, I think, just about where we are in payments and mobile specifically. So let's get into what can stand in our way, some of the speed bumps that we've experienced so far, but also what we still have to work through.
Surely. But before I get there, as you mentioned, and I thought it's apt to make a point here, a CEO of a very large bank recently made a statement that the competition is actually going to come from the Silicon Valley for banking and payments, and I think that's interesting in terms of the times and age we are living in. Having said that, now coming to your question about the speed bumps, I look at it two areas broadly, which if you were to look at any of the stakeholders that in the overall system, that should be the consumer, the merchant stroke business, or the service provider, and the service provider could be a payment processor or a bank or a telecom operator, for example. I think they kind of really look at these two aspects a little differently. And for me, they are security and privacy. So depending on which you're looking at from which stakeholder, the perspective would be different. And before we get into kind of more details on it, I want to say that a consumer is really looking at a better user experience with the mobile or the mobility device being as small as it could be. How do I kind of intuitively make a transaction without too much of a hitch? And for me, that's what I think Apple Pay seems to have done. Just put your finger or a thumb on the Touch ID device, and the payment's done. So that's what they're kind of intuitively looking at. But inherently, they're obviously looking for security. At the same time, the merchants are wanting to kind of, or the businesses are wanting to look at and say that I don't need a compromise. I want to ensure that the payments come through properly to me. And a bank or a service provider finally saying, I need to ensure that the wafer thin margins that we're talking about in the payments industry, how do I ensure that whatever transactions are happening, the possibilities of fraud or breaches are next to zero, if not zero. And that again, I kind of clearly see, depending on which parts of the world, the overall thought process amongst these three stakeholders, I clearly see a bit of a difference, especially in the context of North America and Europe. I clearly see that the approach and the thinking also seems to be a little different.
So I'd love to get your perspective on what consumers think the difference between security and privacy is when it comes to payments. I mean, I understand obviously the security piece of it with all of the breaches, but is privacy a concern about how their data is used, or is privacy kind of the flip side to security, that they're just concerned that their credentials aren't kept private, therefore they could be compromised by the bad guys? Do you have a sense of that?
Absolutely. And I think that's an interesting point if I were to look at from a consumer standpoint, which is that there's a lot of footprint of credentials that I'm kind of leaving out there in the digital world. So I think for me, what is most important is how do consumers perceive the security levels to be? That's point one. Point number two, on the aspect of privacy, it is about the feeling that I want to control what I want to do when. I think as long as we're able to kind of look at that option, I think suddenly you would see a shift in the overall approach and behavior. So what we've kind of currently seen is that the belief is that somebody wants to kind of take that information from me and or at the same time saying that I don't want to be bombarded with a lot of information from anybody else, and it should make sense to me. So as long as those aspects are taken care of, for me, the privacy thought process or the issue actually just goes out of the window. Similarly, in the context of security, I just want to kind of bring a very interesting analogy. And this is a very Indian example, but I don't think it's different anywhere. So in the early days of e-commerce adoption, there's a lot of scare that if I were to kind of put my card number details on the website, it would be compromised. And one of the largest website in India on the e-commerce front is the Indian Railways ticketing site. There was a lot of problems earlier that we had to stand in long queues to book our train tickets. But when the website was introduced, what really happened was the number of transactions that was happening through the e-commerce site just went through the roof. And the simple reason was the pain of standing in a queue was just not bearable for an average consumer. So people who thought a few $1,000s would have been compromised were ready to get that compromised for 1 hour of saving and standing in the queue. So I think it's a mindset. It's about the perception, and it's about the requirement that is important, and then suddenly we will realize that security for me is finally a state of mind. I may be a bit philosophical here, but that's what I've clearly seen in terms of consumer behavior pretty much across the globe.
Well, I think you make a great point, and that is that if you eliminate friction, consumers are always making trade-offs about what they're going to do and how it's going to improve their situation. So the example that you just cited, clearly the risk of security being compromised versus the pain of taking the morning and standing in line, was worth the trade-off. And I think consumers do that with privacy too. I mean, consumers all the time trade off access to their, credentials or behavior because they get something in return. They give merchants their information to get offers or to join a loyalty program to get something back. So, I think it is about those trade-offs, and it is about having a very clear and compelling value proposition to get consumers in the state of mind that you just pointed out. But obviously, a lot is going on in the payments ecosystem to try to solve the very real problems of breaches, keeping credentials secure and private. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Surely, and I think that's a very interesting topic for me. And I've seen the way the industry has been evolving over the past 6 to 7 years. And the most important piece in that is NFC. The way we've seen NFC evolve. So 6 years back, NFC was what is going to save us. 2 years back, NFC was something of the past. And that's where I think we've kind of clearly seen HCE really coming up, and I think that's where the industry seems to have been a bit reinvigorated for me. And that's where I think a lot of aspects of not just security, but the user experience also has kind of gained, is the way I would look at it. And the best example, obviously, is Apple Pay. But I clearly see that happening in the other platforms, be it Android or Microsoft. So in the context of HCE, what we've kind of seen is the ability to take off one friction, which is dependence on a specific hardware, or the requirement for me to kind of change a SIM card or get keys from a specific OEM, etc., has been totally eliminated. And what it kind of really meant was I just need to kind of download an app, and then I kind of get my credentials through the overall what's called the tokenization system. So two important aspects, HCE and tokenization, suddenly seems to have shifted the way the proximity or over the payments market works in the context of NFC. And in there, what we've kind of observed is the first step was, as it's called, cloud-based payments, where you're really storing the credentials on the cloud. But from there, we've gone to the place of saying, how would it be that if I were to store those credentials pretty much on my phone within my software? And there came the aspect of white box cryptography. And that, I think, itself has been a great achievement for me. And suddenly, without really having the problem of data connectivity, for example, I could end up making a transaction. Now, here, while that pretty much seems to be something that's being adopted, say, in North America, we're talking to a few banks in Canada, for example, we clearly see that this is something that seems to be good enough and secure enough to really push that kind of a solution, and the pain of changing a SIM card or download something remotely suddenly is taking off one pain point or one frictional element, and therefore they're making it much more easier for the consumer. But if I were to look at Europe, for example, we've been talking to a few banks, and clearly there the belief is, and I know one of the regulators also made the statement, that they believe that apart from software, a bit of a hardware element on the device is critical to ensure that their approach towards risk gets a little more easy, or they would really be willing to look at the overall mobile payments. And that's where we believe that the aspect of what I call hybrid way of looking at the market is something that is evolving, which is basically how do I, using the security algorithms, for example, and put it in two different elements. One piece of it in the application as a software on the device, and the second one in a hardware element, let's say a SIM card. And that really makes the system very secure. But at the same time, for the consumer, there's no difference. It's as easy as making an Apple Pay transaction. So I think that's the shift that I see in the market. And again, the shift or adoption is pretty much a function for me of a region or a geography, and therefore I think we'll kind of see this different approaches being adopted pretty much across basis, the risk appetite and the security mindset, if I may, that will prevail in these different regions. A long answer, but I should have.
So I'd love to understand more about the hybrid model, and then I think we'll have some questions. I know you have a little bit more detail describing that. Why don't you go through that?
So yeah, surely. So what I kind of would make of the hybrid model basically is to say that I was first talking about the software-only approach, where in what I call the disconnected mode, we are storing the tokens, which is mapping to the actual card number, which is stored in the back end, pretty much safely in the card in the processing systems of issuers, which pretty much are banks. But a lot of times people believe that software only is not good enough from a security standpoint. While we believe it's a decently secure system, as I mentioned, for organizations or entities where they believe that itself is not good enough, the feeling of the approach is saying, how do I put my algorithm or specific credentials split. Therefore, even if certain part of the information is captured, it is useless because the other part is securely elsewhere, which is in hardware. Because as logic would have it, anything which is in the hardware is far more difficult to break into, and therefore it's that much more difficult to kind of get these two pieces together. And only once I get these two pieces together can I really compromise a specific token in that phone. So that is the approach that we believe is making a bit of interesting news. And with that kind of an approach, in this approach, basically, we need to kind of tie up with, say, a telecom operator, but it really brings in that much of a risk averseness, because this third entity which is storing a part of the credential, and therefore the weight of or the ability for somebody to kind of compromise is that much more difficult, and therefore I think in certain parts of the market we believe that will really propel the overall NFC market.
So does that introduce a new player to the ecosystem, and therefore another player that needs to be fed in the business model, which is mobile payments?
I think that's a very interesting point and a question. In the earlier NFC ecosystem, this was pretty much relevant, and we had other players like a TSM, etc. So in the context of NetC, even in a hybrid model, so we're really taking off the need of a TSM and really simplifying the way the payments markets would work rather. The second point, yes, while we're introducing one more player in the mix, but we believe that the complexity involved in having a partnership has been really been reduced, and therefore the relevance of the right players for the right requirements has now kind of come in, and also we believe that while there's an extra player in the overall scheme of things, it really wouldn't bring down the margins substantially that we would need to worry about.
But I think the other concern is, a lot of the concerns that you would imagine be raised in a situation like this, where it's not just the business model, but then it's who controls access to that customer. And back in the old days of NFC, I mean, that was one of the big reasons that NFC just never got a lot of traction. There was a concern that there were not only lots of different players that needed to have a business model that made it right for them, but then who really controlled access to the consumer, their data, and so forth. Does this model that you described raise any of those questions as well?
Not really. I think in the context of the hybrid model, I think the service provider in this context, let's say a bank, for example, pretty much controls and looks at the consumer data. What is really being transferred is only a credential, and that was part of the credential. So, and therefore, I don't think we're really complicating the matter by getting back into the olden days, as you just mentioned, and very rightly so, that the ownership of the consumer again becomes a bit of an issue. I don't think that debate is relevant anymore.
So you touched on the consumer, and I think we all know that consumers really hold the keys. Because at the end of the day, they're the people who are being asked to change, and then you have to convince them that there's enough friction associated with what they're doing now that a new thing is better. So talk a little bit about your experiences in getting consumers over the hump.
Sure. And that, I think, is for me the most difficult thing to do, because you're really trying to kind of get a behavioral shift. And any change behaviors is always going to take that much longer. And that's when I believe that if you're able to kind of introduce or incentivize or attract, the way you want to look at it, for the consumers in their overall commerce or buying behavioral process, I believe that the overall push would happen. So while we can always say, yes, I mean, if there's a bit of mousetrap, there would be enough attraction, I think there's going to be an effort required in making the consumers aware by educating them and ensuring that the right value propositions are conveyed. So just to kind of give a small example, and that brings me back to the original point on the privacy aspects, for example. Let's look at the contextuality. The mobility devices are really what bring in contextuality. And if I were to be in a specific aisle, and that means that I may be really wanting to buy for something out there, if the retailer is able to kind of communicate to the consumer with the right offer or the right discount, suddenly the consumer would see a lot of value. Similarly, if I were to kind of be going around into a specific mall or a movie theater, and if I were to get the right information about what's really more relevant for me, suddenly the contextuality brings in that much more value to the consumer. So I think it's really focusing on what the consumer would want, and as long as I'm able to target it that way, the shift would be that much easier, and the adoption would really follow that much faster.
So what are you seeing? And maybe this varies by geography. I know there are some really interesting things happening in India where the incentive is to, as you point out, to avoid standing in lines to buy tickets, to pay bills, and there's some clever schemes around couponing and offers to incent consumers to do that. But what are some of the other things that you're seeing your clients try and they have tried with some success?
Sure. Again, I think this is depending on the kind of a market that we are in. We've seen different things being successful. For me, in the context of, maybe let me start from the bottom of emerging markets and then go all the way up. And I've seen enough and more different success stories, if I may. That kind of, in the context of emerging markets, is pretty much tapping into the fundamental requirement of having a banking or a payments account by which they can conveniently and securely and safely store their money and then use it whenever they want for various of the transactions. That in itself clearly has translated into, as I mentioned, 45% of the market in Zimbabwe, for example, or Kenya is are enough examples. But if I were to kind of really go up the value chain and say how are consumers really adopting to it in the context of an evolved consumer, and an evolved consumer is somebody who's digitally more aligned. And that is where what we've kind of really seen our customers do, for example, is really focus on specific need gaps. And I've seen, for example, one of our customers really focus and say that bring in the contextuality, bring in aspects like couponing, for example, and ensure that I'm able to fulfill a specific requirement of theirs. And that suddenly shoots up the adoption rate. The second example I would want to talk about, and this is an interesting thing that I see in Chile, for example, one of our customers trying to do is really bring in a different shopping experience, bringing in an overall technology-based approach to bring in the farmers and the consumers together and pick up the produce, and at the same time check out seamlessly. I mean, while we've obviously heard of Uber doing the same thing, where you just walk out of the something similar I've seen happening or proposed to happen rather in Chile, where I buy my goods and I just walk out of the store without really having to take out my card, but it's pretty much debited from my account because I know that I'm in the store through my app and the payment's done. So I think different regions clearly showing different movements is what I would say. And one final point I wanted to make sure, and I know I've been diverting or deviating from the consumer topic, but it's important that we just call out that while we've talked about consumers, an interesting movement very clearly is also on the merchant and the business side, which is about using the mobile POS as what we would call, but the mobile POS is just the beginning of an overall integrated approach of focusing towards the merchant or the business. So apart from making large and medium merchants accept payments while on the go, so the mobility element kicks in and enabling or deepening the penetration in the context of an SME or an SMB. But how do I also look at providing various payment-related services or experiences to the merchant and the business is also something that I believe the other side of the coin, clearly a lot of action happening there. And that's pretty much from the US where there's enough penetration, but clearly I see a lot of customers that we're trying to work with also see a lot of movement on that front as well. So I thought I'll just call that out. I know we're really running out of time, but it was important that I just call that specific point out.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. I think it is very relevant to look at the consumer requirements in different parts of the world. As you point out, in emerging markets, just having access via a phone to financial services that weren't available is critical. Of course, in developed economies, it introduces too much friction to consumers that have a pretty convenient, reliable, ubiquitous experience at the point of sale. So it's really a tale almost of two extremes, and then a lot in the middle. So we've got our work cut out for us. So as we're wrapping up, I know you had an example of a digital wallet that you wanted to talk about. Why don't you share with us something that you think is kind of cool and has some potential?
Surely, and I think the way I look at a digital wallet, and thank you for really asking me this question, is I would say what I call it as digital container of your credentials. And the credentials could be your payment instruments, your ID-based instruments or access. So what I mean by that is, how do I really put various of my cards, be it my prepaid instrument, be it my credit card or a debit card, in a single place, and also have my ID elements built in to ensure that I get access into specific areas. So the ability for me to get authenticated, authorized, and get entry in a very integrated fashion, I think for me is clearly the way the world is moving towards. And while we've seen bits and pieces of that happening and also in pretty much different pockets, the ability for me to stitch together an integrated experience, be it in an online or a proximity or over-the-counter world, I think really is what will bring in the consumer adoption. So if I were to kind of look at, coming back to the example of Starbucks, there's a lot of traction that kind of we kind of see happening. And at the same time, obviously, we talk about Apple Pay or PayPal. But how would it look like if at all I wanted to do a transaction online, but complete it while I'm at the store? The ability for me to kind of do that, I think, is only possible through the concept of a digital wallet, and that too with the mobile or a mobility device that we're really talking about. And for me, that's pretty much the future. And I see enough banks and other service providers clearly walking that path. And I would kind of give it a 2 to 3 year timeline before which we can kind of see this overall integrated experience really shaping the way we really do all our transactions. So that's the way I really wanted to put across. my point of view on the wallet.
So you think it's just 2 to 3 years away? Wow. I mean, because I'm looking at your slide, and it all sounds great, but we're having such trouble consistently getting, just a payment experience, on a particular technology platform, using, a particular way of interacting with merchants. That strikes me as certainly goal worthy, but very hard to achieve. What makes you think 2 to 3 years is the right time frame?
Sure. So for me, the way I look at it is that we keep struggling, we keep hoping that the adoption curve happens, and sometimes false expectations, sometimes unrealistic expectations. And before you know, one day, suddenly the adoption takes off. Now, for me, the way I would want to look at it is saying, are the building blocks ready? Are the elements all in place? So I think that is what makes me believe that with the right movements pretty much across the industry, with the players coming together, with the standards and specifications coming together, and the various, for want of a better term, technologies like location-based proximity payments like NFC or QR, I think all of them are just kind of converting together. It's just that now moving to the next level of saying the early adopters are there, how do we push it and ensure that the adoption curve, the usual hockey stick or the S-curve really kicks in. And if all the elements are there together, for me, 2 to 3 years, I don't think is an unrealistic expectation, is what I would say.
Wow, I think I think there may be certain areas of the world where, to your earlier point about mobile phones bringing such value because it's introducing access to payment and financial services where it didn't exist before. I guess I could see that. I still think it's tough in these developed markets where you have so many things that have to all come together in a time frame that is kind of short. I mean, 2 to 3 years, it'll be here before we blink our eyes. Maybe in some merchant categories, there could be more of a tipping as, food services and restaurants, as an example, because of the nature of their business, adopt a technology. This is going back to the app point you made earlier, an app-based payment system that allows consumers to basically interact that way. I could maybe see something like that. I think wholesale, it's still very hard for me to imagine a 2 to 3 year time frame.
Yeah, I think I just hope that we speak again in 2 to 3 years' time.
We'll bury a time capsule with this webinar transcript in it, and we'll dig it out in 2.5 years, and we'll see where we are. How's that?
Absolutely, Karen. But for me, I think the only point I would say is that a lot of things are already happening and we've not realized. And I come back to my Uber point. How many of the taxi rides now happen without me taking out my card anymore? So that clearly manifests a specific way of transacting. Even if I were to leave out the online side, I think the shift along with the EMV and contactless happening in the US, I'm hopeful. And as you said, let's kind of hope we meet up again in 2 to 3 years and say we said it.
Well, I think on that note, there's nothing better than ending a discussion like this on a note like that, where I think a couple of things that I've taken away from our discussion, which I found to be really interesting and very informative. We are making progress. Things are happening, and they're happening in different ways at different speeds around the world. And the point you made at the very beginning is I think the important point here. We really have to make sure we're adding value to consumers and that we're eliminating friction by making the experience better. And if that happens, the time frame will be what the time frame will be, and we'll bury this transcript. In 2.5 years from now, we'll reconvene and we'll see how far we've come. Srini, it was a real pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me here.
And everyone who joined, thank you for taking time out of your day to be part of our conversation. We'll post a transcript, article, and link online in just a couple of days. And on that note, have a great rest of the day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.